or I
Hey,
should say
Becky.
live
Hey,
stream.
Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
How's everybody doing this afternoon?
Doing great. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Great.
Hi, guys. Good
Hi.
to hear you guys.
Good to see you.
Yeah,
Oh my
Jason,
gosh.
you might.
Hi, Corey. How you doing?
Hey, Corey.
Good morning,
Hey,
everybody.
Corey.
Good morning.
Morning.
So, Corey, thanks for joining everybody on the panel. I'm about to introduce. This is Corey, who is the host of Cafe Bitcoin, and we're very excited that he is joining us here today with a very special, I'd say almost presidential visit to Cafe Bitcoin, Corey. So we're having the Commissioner Hester Peirce come by in a minute. Did you want to say a few words? And then I was going to introduce the panel and we'll just share a little bit, and we'll be having her arrive hopefully right at 1.
No, I actually just jumped up to the stage so I could ping a bunch of people in. I'll
Awesome.
be here for about 15 minutes and then I got to jump, but really excited this is happening and thank you so much for organizing it.
Of course. Thank you, Corey. Thank you for the great Cafe Bitcoin experience in the room.
Thank you.
You have a great day, and appreciate the help and support. So let me introduce our panel ahead of our special guest. And then maybe we can all level set just a little bit about who exactly is coming to visit us and what we're hoping to learn and find out about today here in Cafe Bitcoin. So first, next to me is Donna Riddell. Donna Riddell is a professor of blockchain digital assets at Fordham Law School, an advisor investor focusing on financial and technologies as well as blockchain. She was the managing director of the World Economic Forum and was the first woman to chair a USA exchange, the Commodities Exchange. Donna is a committee membership and is a member of the New York State Committee for Advancement in Women's Leadership in Financial Services. Donna, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. And Jason, thank you for putting this together. Thank you, Corey, for hosting Cafe Bitcoin. And we're really excited to have a conversation with Commissioner Peirce.
Absolutely. Michelle, Tiana, who's next to me, Tiana Baker-Taylor, is the UK General Manager at Crypto.com. Before coming back to the commercial side of crypto, she established and led global digital finance, working with global policymakers like the FATF, BIS, and OECD, as well as national regulators focusing on establishing global best practices for industry participants and identifying areas where regulatory gaps might be harmonized across jurisdictions. Tiana is on the steering committee of the Global Blockchain Convergence, who conducts advocacy for market and policy frameworks. She's an executive board member of Crypto UK, the UK's trade body for crypto, and was formerly on the board of Blockchain for Europe, a Brussels-based organization working with EU policymakers and the EC level to develop a European regulatory framework that supports blockchain-based innovation. Welcome, Tina.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me, and thanks for letting us use the room, Corey, even though you left.
All right, excellent. And Michelle Bond, hi, Michelle, as the CEO of the Association for Digital Asset Markets, also called ADAM. She's an expert in securities, derivatives, banking, and fintech regulation. Before leading ADAM, a trade association known for its code of conduct, she developed and executed global regulatory strategy for digital assets, blockchain, global payments, and fintech at two fintech companies and Bloomberg LP. She also worked as a senior counsel in 2 leading policymaker roles, including the Senate Banking Committee, where she worked on the Dodd-Frank Act and its technical corrections bill, and then the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, where she developed the related implementation regulations. And of course, now at ADAM is working very hard on getting those institutional buyers to join in and buy the Bitcoin. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you, with Commissioner Peirce, and these amazing speakers. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And last but certainly not least, Stephen Pally, who is a partner in the DC office of the Anderson Kill Law Firm, where he founded and chaired the firm's crypto practice. I'd say also a very prolific writer, an influencer on Twitter, and an excellent attorney who I've had the pleasure of working with on at least one bank charter. So Stephen, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today with Hester.
Thanks for organizing this and for including me. I'm looking forward to it, Jason.
Absolutely. And British, thanks for joining the stage. We're going to kind of keep the stage limited today to the best of our ability, just based on the request of the commissioner and her counsel. The folks I just introduced are going to be ones who are going to be asking the first sort of rounds of questions. And I want to kind of just take about 10 minutes while we wait for her arrival to chat about things a bit and get your expert opinions. And then probably about maybe halfway through the event, or maybe 25 minutes left, we'll be bringing up people with their questions for the commissioner. I don't know almost where to start, and I guess I'm gonna call on Michelle, who I know knows the commissioner very well, to sort of explain a little bit of who she is in the ecosystem. You've served at the Senate, you've served at the SEC. What's her role, and why has she been positive, particularly here in Cafe Bitcoin, and for what could be the decision for a future Bitcoin ETF?
Yeah, so the commissioner and I worked together on the Senate Banking Committee, and this was both, so we were both staffers for Senator Shelby on banking. This was probably about 10 years ago, so I'm really dating myself. But in any event, I got to work closely with her. And it's really funny because the topic that we worked on at that time was Title VII, because it was all during Dodd-Frank. And I see a lot of corollaries, because Title VII really governed that's the derivatives regime that we have today. That's the swaps regulatory regime. So I got to work really closely with her on that, and I think that's very similar to what what we're kind of seeing in crypto these days. So and I can give you more about her background if you like.
Give me 1 second, Michelle, because it looks like the commissioner just joined us. Hello, Commissioner.
Oh, great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can hear you great. Thank you.
All right.
And Coy, I see you. Welcome.
Thanks.
All right. Well, welcome to Cafe Bitcoin, Commissioner Peirce. I won't lie and say I have been excited all day about this moment. So,
as have I.
All right. Yeah, it's great to have you here on Clubhouse. It's great to have you here with a ton of Bitcoin supporters and folks really interested in this new technology. So I'm going to introduce you real quick, and then we're going to turn to our panelists, who are going to have some interactive questions with you and talk about kind of what's going on. I hope you're doing well today.
I am. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Hester Peirce was appointed by President Donald Trump to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and was sworn in on January 11th, 2018. Prior to joining the SEC, Commissioner Peirce conducted research on the regulation of financial markets at the Mercatus Center and at George Mason University. She was a senior counsel on the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs, where she advised Ranking Member Richard Shelby and other members of the committee on securities issues. Commissioner Peirce served as a counsel to SEC Commissioner Paul S. Atkins. She also worked as a staff attorney in the SEC's Division of Investment Management. Commissioner Peirce was an associate at Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, now Wilmer Hale, and clerked for Judge Roger Andewell in the Court of Federal Claims. Commissioner Peirce earned her bachelor's degree in economics from Case Western Reserve University and her JD from Yale Law School. Well, welcome this afternoon, Commissioner. And we were just having, who I know you know pretty well, Michelle Bond, who was talking a little bit about your role and who you are at the SEC. Michelle, why don't I turn it right back to you, and you can start us off with the question and get the conversation going.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. And I'm thrilled to be talking with you, Commissioner Peirce. And hi, Coy. It's so good to see you here as well. I think let's dive right into the topic. I think that's top of mind for a lot of people these days, and certainly a topic that Commissioner Peirce has been vocal about in the past, which is the Bitcoin ETF. I think, we've seen a lot of recent action, actually, particularly in other countries. We've seen approvals in Canada and Brazil, and obviously there was a staff statement that was somewhat related from last week. And I'd love to get, Commissioner Peirce, I'd love to get, your views on how you think things are progressing. Of course, we have a new SEC chairman. He's in the process of staffing up, and I think it's going to be a really interesting space to watch. One of the things that I've been hearing just from my perch is, concerns about whether the SEC is becoming more of a merit-based regulator, which is something that we've seen, like, for example, China and, securities regulation is more of a merit-based regime as opposed to a disclosure regime. So that's been one topic that I've been hearing about, in terms of a Bitcoin ETF and sort of just some of the delays in getting it across the finish line. And then also kind of just, if you don't mind talking about thoughts about some of the other protections that would be available to investors. I mean, obviously there would be more transparency and disclosure, but there would be other securities law protections that would come into place as well. For example, with like suitability, and in fact, actually, perhaps the Bitcoin ETF could give, I think, actually, the investing public a lot more, and the SEC as a regulator a lot more comfort. So, in any event, would love to get your thoughts on the Bitcoin ETF, Commissioner.
Thanks, Michelle, and it's great to be here with you as well. Michelle and I worked together now many years ago, and so it's great to have the chance to talk to you again. I do have to start with my standard disclaimer, which is that the views I represent are my own views and not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. I know that disclaimer drives people crazy because they think that we should be able to speak for everyone, but if I could speak for everyone, we wouldn't be talking about this question because we would have already approved a Bitcoin exchange traded product. So, I think this is, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say there'd be no need for your dissents. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. But, there is value to having a commission with five different voices and 5 different ways of thinking about things. And so my colleagues have really emphasized issues around investor protection and trying to understand the Bitcoin markets. And I understand that. But I do think that we have made it more difficult for ourselves by waiting to approve an exchange traded product until the market is as mature as it is. So, I think we have a new moment now that we have a new chairman who comes to the agency with a lot of experience in a lot of areas, regulatory areas, market areas, but also with respect to thinking about crypto. And so I'm optimistic that he'll be able to grasp the issues around a Bitcoin exchange traded product very easily. And some of the he's someone who really likes data. So I think some of the questions that have been asked of would-be sponsors of exchange traded products around the data will be of interest to him. And we've gotten a lot of data in response to those requests. So I'm optimistic that will make a difference. At the same time, I've said this many times before, I think the standard that we set up in this area is one that we haven't applied with respect to other types of exchange traded products. And that touches on the point that Michelle raised about, is the SEC becoming a merit regulator? I think that's something I'm always pushing back against, because the role of the SEC is to get investors disclosure that they need to make decisions, not to make the decisions for them. And even with something new, and Bitcoin isn't even that new anymore, but something relatively new, it shouldn't be our place to displace investors. The Bitcoin futures markets are pretty established. The Bitcoin exchange traded products, as Michelle mentioned, are trading in other jurisdictions. And I think those 2 facts can be really helpful for us as we, I hope, consider taking a new look at exchange traded products. Michelle also mentioned the staff statement that came out a week or so ago, raising a number of issues around 40 Act funds that have some kind of exposure to Bitcoin. you know, I wasn't so excited about the tone of that statement because I did think it had a little bit of a merit regulation type of tone. But the bottom line there is that there are funds that are giving investors some exposure to Bitcoin through Bitcoin futures, and so that is already happening, and so it gives investors the opportunity to get access to Bitcoin through a fund that has all the protections of the 40 Act, and that also enables them to have it in their portfolios in a way that they have other types of things in their portfolios, assets in their portfolios. So it's convenient. And as Michelle mentioned, there's also an element around then when financial professionals are wanting to help investors get access to products, they can do it, and they're subject to all of the regulations that govern their interactions with investors. So there is some progress being made at the agency, but it's well, I think we have a lot to see based on what our new chairman decides to do.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate those remarks. I mean, because I feel like one of the things that we would see is more transparency into bid and ask spreads, and we would see more information about, like premiums, discounts, and the investor would get more information and powers to be able to choose, like, how they want to invest and have greater abilities. So I view this on the whole as a really good thing, and I do see, obviously all of the suitability protections that would come into play as well. One of the other topics that we also talk a lot about is surveillance. And certainly we've seen a lot of the surveillance providers, the traditional vendors from the other regulated markets entering this space. And and they're able to sort of apply their surveillance tools to these markets as well. And we're hoping that that's going to help alleviate some of the the SEC's historical concerns, at least on that side, because I don't think, I don't speak for the SEC, but I don't think the SEC's perspective is that these markets are inherently unsurveillable, if you will.
No, I think that's true. And as we're seeing more institutional participation, we're seeing more of the things that look familiar to us as a regulator. But I still go back to the point that I made in dissenting from the disapprovals of Bitcoin exchange traded products, which is that, we don't have to have an underlying market that looks exactly like an SEC regulated market. That shouldn't be a requirement for an exchange traded product to exist. And that's something that I think we do need to be careful about. That said, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this at some point today, the chairman has indicated an interest in seeing spot markets for crypto regulated. So perhaps that is the road that we're going to regulate it at the federal level. So perhaps that's a road that people will be exploring.
Absolutely. And I think I'd love to turn it to Donna Riddell now. Donna, if you wanted to introduce yourself to the commissioner, and I know you and I had been talking about this earlier in the week. So
yes, hello, Commissioner. I think we know each other, but just to repeat again, because so many people come into your ambit, Donna Riddell, formerly chairman of the COMEX and involved with teaching at Fordham Law School on crypto and blockchain. Yes, we were talking about earlier this week, Jason and others here, about regulation and about exchanges, which kind of brings up a topic that the new chairman brought up, which is working in collaboration with the CFTC. And you did mention, Commissioner, that we have futures there. Would you give some vantage point on the fact that Bitcoin does change on a regulated futures market, it is by a sister agency in the federal government. Is the view that the general view in the SEC that we would be now having a collaboration with the CFTC as the chairman indicated before the Congress? What's your view on that, and how would you see that impacting regulation in the future? Thank you.
Well, Donna, thank you, and I appreciate your work in this area and your involvement in this area. I think the CFTC has really laid good groundwork for us to do something in our space, because the Bitcoin futures have been trading for quite a while, and I think that there's a lot of room for us to work together, for the two agencies to work together, and I think that's especially true because we have a chairman who was the chairman of the CFTC, and so brings a real appreciation for that agency and for its mission, and I think we can work together. Now, when it comes to to regulating the spot markets, I mean, the CFTC has some limited role there, but it's very limited. And so is Congress going to decide that it wants to do something more and create a federal regulator or provide authority to an existing federal financial regulator to regulate these markets? That is certainly above my pay grade.
Thank you.
And Tina, did you want to go ahead and say hello and ask questions along those lines too, or what you had in mind?
Hi, Commissioner Peirce. It's been a while since we've seen each other. I think the last time was in New York at the .com event, so it's nice to see you again. I just have a follow-up question, actually, on this topic, and it's one I think that we've spoken about before with different approaches potentially to the type of regulatory regime that we've seen in the US historically. So I'll just put it out there controversially. Do you think it's possible that the US would ever consider implementing a co-regulatory regime with an SRO type organization? So something similar to what Japan has implemented with the JVCEA, working closely with both the industry and the regulator to oversee regulatory compliance, seems to have kind of pushed that forward in Japan, at least certainly around clarity. Do you think that this is something that the US would ever consider implementing?
I mean, I think it's possible. We certainly have, and it's good to see you again, Tina, or hear you again at least. It is possible that we would do something like that because we have a tradition of having or we call them self-regulatory organizations. Sometimes they're more like quasi-governmental regulatory organizations. So I can imagine that there would be something like that. But again, it really is up to Congress to figure out how to do this, and I'm not sure what the best approach is in this regard. I think it's an area where people who are in this space really need to weigh in and think about what the best regulatory structure is, which can be difficult to think about in a space where a lot of people are not really big fans of regulation at all. So I think it's wise to start thinking about that now, because I think there'll be more and more interest in figuring out what the right regulatory approach is. I mean, I'd love to hear from all of you what you think, we should be thinking about at the SEC, but also what you think about some of these bigger questions about what the right regulatory structure is for this space.
Well, I've gone on record before, and we've had this conversation kind of around sandboxes as well with, industry participation, that in the industry, we're almost certainly more likely to identify potential manipulation or, scams or, just kind of malfeasance in the market long before the regulator gets wind of it. And so I just feel like there must be some way to work more collaboratively. And the industry has indicated a desire to police itself. Now, without some teeth around that, it could be considered virtue signaling. But I do think that some kind of participatory initiative that includes self-accountability would have a greater chance of detecting issues and addressing them potentially sooner than we do today.
And Commissioner and Tina, I mean, that's what the Association for Digital Asset Markets is really dedicated to. We have our code of conduct, and all of our members agree to adhere to the principles that are outlined in our code of conduct. And it's basically to establish market integrity and fairness, efficiency, compliance for entities in this space. So I do think that there is definitely a strong role for industry to play. And I think that also gives institutional grade participants some comfort as they navigate this new territory.
I also want to have Stephen Pally jump in. Commissioner, I hope I get credit. I have a four-person panel here. 3 out of 4 are female leaders in the space, which is really exciting. Stephen Pally, a lawyer from Anderson Kill. I think, my question, and I'll lead in this for Stephen, that he was talking about before you were joining, is the role of the attorney when going to the SEC with certain clients and sort of the shepherdship that needs to be shown. I think, this is mainly a Bitcoin room, right? And so we're big fans of Bitcoin, and sometimes there's other products, you sort of develop with the safe harbor, but what's the right way for sort of those interacting with people here in the stage who are interested in developing in the space, working with their lawyers? And Stephen, why don't you tell about clients you work with, and what you'd like to see there?
Sure. Commissioner Peirce, I don't believe we've met in person before. It's a pleasure to meet you here virtually, and thanks for your time. So yeah, sort of in the trenches, sitting in a law office and fielding calls, I get one of the frustrations that one has as a practitioner is we get clients who call and say they want to do X, Y, and Z. I literally had a client call, potential client, we didn't take the work, call 2 weeks ago, and basically describe the Howey test. It wasn't orange groves, it was something else. And one of the hard things that we have to do is respond to people who say, well, X, Y, and Z projects are doing this, and as far as we can tell, the SEC hasn't said anything. So how do we, it seems like maybe this is a problem, and our response is pretty obvious from my standpoint, which is, we don't know what the SEC is doing. All I can tell you is what I believe the law is. And, if you want to do that, you'll need to either register or claim an exemption or go get no action relief. But it seems like a policy of regulation by enforcement has led some to suggest that the playing field is not even. Do you think that's a fair critique, number one? And number two, what if you were in my shoes or in the shoes of a practitioner, responding to people who can point to operational projects that appear to be violating securities laws, the 33 Act, the 34 Act in particular? How would you respond to them when they want to do the same thing?
Well, it's nice to meet you, and I certainly have seen many of your comments on Twitter, which I think are in line with the question that you just asked. And express some of the same frustrations. And I certainly get that, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to do something that would provide a regulatory framework within which projects could operate, and then ones that chose to, it wouldn't be an exclusive safe harbor, but ones that chose to do things in a way that was not consistent with the securities laws would face enforcement action by the SEC. I think that's a better approach to establish as clear as possible regulatory framework, and then allow people to choose whether they want to operate within that or not. But part of the problem with the securities laws is that they're intentionally broad, they're intentionally principles based. And so there is always going to be some gray area. And we have certainly brought many enforcement actions. Many of them are in cases where there's been fraud, but there have been many others where it's just a registration violation. And there was, certainly, as is true in any other area where we regulate, there is no shortage of cases that we could bring. I've had issues with a lot of the registration cases because I think we haven't established that framework, and I just think it's backwards to start bringing enforcement actions if you don't have a framework in place. That said, if I were in your shoes, I would probably say the same thing that you do, which is that you have to make. I mean, it's like a parent tells a child, just because other kids are doing it doesn't mean that you get to do it also. There are rules in place, and you've got to make your choice about whether you want to follow them. And if you don't follow them, you've got to be prepared to face the consequences of not following them. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think there's I've followed with interest your safe harbor proposal. I have to admit, I wasn't sure. Your first iteration of that, I was skeptical, but I thought your second iteration answered some questions. Do you think that there is a chance that some form of that safe harbor will be implemented? And maybe for those who are listening in who aren't familiar with it, perhaps you could give just a minute or two explanation of what your proposal is.
Sure. The safe harbor proposal is intended to give projects a 3-year period of time in which they could operate. It's intended to allow token distribution events to happen and have a 3-year period before you really have to show that the project is decentralized or functional, at which point, if it's not decentralized or functional, you would have to register the tokens as securities. And it would provide for a set of disclosures that would be made at the outset and then periodically updated throughout the use of the safe harbor, which would be intended to provide some of the information that I think purchasers of tokens need to have about the team and about the token economics, and other relevant, what your development plans are and so forth. And that the goal is to sort of address the fact that doing a token distribution event is pretty difficult to do in a way that gives you real comfort that you're not going to fall into the Howey test, into the Howey test framework. So that's kind of the goal. Now, as to the likelihood of it or something like it getting adopted, I mean, first of all, I'm not wedded to it. I think we've gotten some great feedback on it. It's on GitHub for anyone who wants to take a look at it, who wants to make comments on it. We've gotten some great comments, some great suggestions of changes. People need to tell the chairman and the other commissioners if they think this is a good idea or if they think something like it is a good idea. Absent my colleagues hearing about it being something that's necessary and that would actually help clean up the regulatory landscape, would help would help purchasers of tokens and would also help projects that are trying to do things right. I think if my colleagues don't hear that, then probably it won't move forward. If my colleagues hear a lot about it, then there's more chance that it will move forward. So the answer to your question is I don't know.
Commissioner, on Donna here, following through a little bit on the safe harbor, I remember in version 1 and version 2 has come a long way. I saw Ulta and Donna in the audience. We did some comments on version 1, and one of the key things with relation to it was the exchanges, which dovetails back to the original questions that we were talking about earlier on with exchange regulation. And I'm mindful of the fact that that your safe harbor kind of puts these token distributions in a non-SEC securities jurisdiction until 3 years. where would you anticipate that these would be trading on, and what would happen if in, at T plus 2 or 3 years where they were a security, they were deemed to be a security? Would they have to be delisted? Would exchanges have, two different types of functionality, one in which they were trading Bitcoin, which is not with a security, and the other ones in which they would trade these other instruments? Thank you.
I think that's a great question, and one that we certainly got some feedback on. So my thinking is that it would trade on platforms that are not registered with us to trade securities. And then if at the end of that period, it is determined that it has to be registered, then there's a period of time given for the trading platforms to to stop trading the tokens. That process will always be a bit messy and difficult, but that's sort of the purpose of having some grace period to allow that to happen. Now, I mean, perhaps if Chair Gensler if his vision of regulating platforms moves forward, then maybe this issue is not much of an issue anymore.
Thank you.
Sorry, Commissioner. This is really we have a huge audience here, and what I really appreciate about you and the leadership you show is the way you interact with the people, right? Like through Twitter, you're here on Clubhouse, which is amazing. And there's a lot of people, I think, that would be curious, like I would right now, to think, what has the creation of Bitcoin meant to you in your career since it came out in 2008? And like, what has it been like looking at it from the commissioner's realm? Because I know you have like our back. I know you have the folks in the Bitcoin audience that want to see all this technology succeed, that want to see changes. Like, what's it been like from your perspective watching this journey since you've been at the SEC?
Well, I mean, I think I started watching it before I got to the SEC, and was really fascinated with the idea behind behind people trying to think about solving a problem, and doing it in a way that was ground up instead of top down. So that always was interesting to me. Now, when I crossed over into the regulatory side of things, I mean, one aspect that I was looking at was just, how can we as a regulator be better with innovation? So that's kind of a very general thing that's certainly not limited to Bitcoin or crypto more generally. But the other piece, I guess, that's been a little bit frustrating for me is that I think a lot of the regulatory structure, the financial regulatory structure, is extremely top down in the United States. And it, sometimes I feel that we've lost our guiding principle, which is that government is there to serve the people. And that means that we're not there to substitute our judgment for the judgment of people. And we're also not there to stop people from engaging in transactions that are mutually beneficial that they voluntarily decide to enter into. We have a specific mandate at the SEC. It's to protect investors, facilitate capital formation, and foster market integrity. And protecting investors is really important, but it also means giving investors the opportunity to make choices for themselves. I have the nickname Crypto Mom, but I'm no one's mother, right? I'm not there to make decisions for you. I'm there to help you get the information that you need to make decisions and to build a regulatory framework that makes sense, but one that really allows people maximum freedom to do what they want. So I guess that's a long way of answering your question, Jason. But I mean, just it is a little bit disheartening sometimes to see a regulatory structure that that doesn't try to maximize people's freedom and liberty. And that's something that I'm trying to change. And look, I think the motives of the people who don't agree with me on this are good motives. They want to stop people from making bad choices and from losing money, and those are important things. But liberty is also really important, and I think we as a society need to remind regulators to re-embrace liberty as an important factor in their decision making.
Wow, that's really powerful. I want to turn over to kind of Michelle, and also we have British Huddle on the stage with us too. And if others want to ask questions, I promise the commissioner doesn't bite, and we want to have open if there's questions you want to ask. But I think Michelle and maybe British, if you could comment a little bit about what you've seen with the institutional adoption. And Commissioner, we've had Michael Saylor pop in these rooms and talk to us, which was like a huge thrill to have a CEO of a company come in and explain his position on Bitcoin. What's the take, Michelle? I know you work a lot on this institutional adoption aspect of Bitcoin.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, that's really how my organization was founded. It was it was because my members wanted to further increase and enhance institutional adoption. And thus far, things are going really well, of course. It's really exciting to see all the major headlines these days. One of the things I think that is a big component of institutional adoption is custody. And I think I really want to commend I think the commissioner and her fellow commissioners did an amazing job on putting out that commission level statement at the end of December, right before Christmas. In case people weren't following, the commission voted on and unanimously approved a statement on custody of digital asset securities by special purpose broker dealers. And in that, the SEC asked a bunch of questions about industry best practices for custody, and in many ways, it's a safe harbor. And then also asked, should we actually expand our position in the future to include other businesses such as traditional securities or non-security digital assets? So I'd love to hear the commissioner's perspective on whether, Commissioner Peirce, whether you think it should be expanded, whether you think it will be expanded, and what the future is for that. And just to give everyone an idea of how long it is, it's a 5-year. It's basically a 5-year safe harbor, and the commission will be accepting comments on it all throughout the 5 years. Adam submitted a comment letter on it. It's publicly filed.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments about that, Michelle, because I think it is a big step forward for the commission to come out with a statement like that, even though I acknowledge that it's very limited in what it allows. And I think that people have raised some really great questions about how it applies and what limitations are on it. And so please keep those questions coming. It is intended to be a safe harbor of sorts, a pilot program. And so we need people to give us feedback about what works and what doesn't. As with so many things in this space, we take a very careful approach, which it makes sense, but it can also be frustrating to people on the outside. So just engage with us. The more concrete questions and concerns you can raise with us, the better, so that we can broaden that out. I mean, it's a 5-year safe harbor, or pilot program, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't make adjustments in it along the way. So one thing that I think we put out statements like this periodically and ask for responses, and there's a lot going on in the industry, and people don't always take the time to respond, but I really do appreciate it when people write in and give us feedback.
Hey, Jason, you mind if I jump in here?
Yeah, please. And just real quick, British, for those in the audience, if a member of, Cafe Bitcoin, please raise your hand and we can have you ask questions as well. So go ahead, British.
Yeah, Commissioner, it's a pleasure. Having talked with Michael Saylor, I know that he sees the chairman as the MVP of Bitcoin for 2021 if everything goes right. So I think your role is very much admired, and I don't think anyone's jealous of your role either. I think in this space at least. So I think you've got a tough road ahead, but I think it's a very important one. So the question that my friend Joe sent to me, which I had a question for you, but I think this question is more important. Based on the SEC's comments that have come out recently, it seems like you're worried about. Well, really, his question is with respect to custody on hot wallets, on exchanges, which if any, what regulations do you support? Because it seems like they're waiting for some form of regulation on protection on exchanges before you approve an ETF, which I don't know, it doesn't quite make sense from my perspective.
Well, I don't know that it makes sense from my perspective that we need it. I just think that it would give some of my colleagues greater comfort if the underlying market looked more like other markets, and that's because they want to see the kinds of things that you just talked about. I mean, they want to see protections for investors. I think one thing we all know about this space is that anytime something bad happens, it gets broadcast far and wide, and so people really are very concerned, and understandably, as more money gets locked up on these platforms, people get worried about whether whether people are going to lose their money. And so I think from my perspective, I don't think regulation of the platforms is necessary, but I do think it would give a lot of people more comfort about what's going on in this space.
Thanks, Commissioner. Bruce, welcome to the stage. Bruce, you need no introduction. How are you? And the question for the Commissioner today?
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks for doing this, and thank you for all of your proactive voice that you've had, being positive on this space. And I really liked what you just said about innovation and freedom. My question is on securities tokens. I think one challenge is that you can't really do anything too significant without a Finra membership, which we have. It took us a very long time. It's a long process, but then firms that are Finra members have to also abide by what Finra says. So I think Finra has sort of been pretty kind of anti-digital digital securities, digital assets in general, and so I think that's been one challenge. You could comply with the regulations and have a Reg B or a Reg CF. We have all this, nice improvements that we have in the exceptions, and but then you can't really do much with it because you could be an issuer, but the real companies that are the backbone of the securities industry, the regulated broker dealers, the SEC regulated firms, it's a very difficult thing for them to kind of even do anything. So my question is, have you, or has the SEC been talking to Finra much? Is there kind of an aligned? It seems like the SEC is almost more positive to these things than Finra. So I'm just kind of curious if there's any discussions about that and what your thoughts are on overall. And thank you.
Well, certainly we talk to Finra all the time. So I think your question, though, is a great question because it really does highlight one of the concerns that I have about self-regulatory organizations in this space, because when you create, FINRA is the regulator, the frontline regulator for broker dealers in the United States. And so when you've got FINRA and then you have SEC overseeing FINRA, there's going to be the need for a lot of communication between the two. And there can also, it can also just add layers to move forward with something if you've got to go through both FINRA and the SEC. Now, there are good reasons for us to have a structure that allows FINRA to regulate broker-dealers, but it can, in instances like this where people are trying to do new things, it can create additional hurdles to jump over. And so I think FINRA is taking its lead somewhat from the SEC. So we think about how legal ambiguity is frustrating for people in the industry and for investors, but it's also difficult for FINRA because FINRA has to do things that it knows then the SEC is going to take a look at what it's doing, and so it's concerned too about what the SEC thinks. So my goal of providing more clarity, I think, will also be helpful to FINRA and will also be helpful to people interacting with FINRA, because then they could point to what the SEC is doing and say, well, the SEC has been clear on this point. I suspect that we're going to see progress in this regard in the coming years, because there is just much more institutional interest. There's much more thinking about how digital assets can really transform the way a lot of traditional securities markets work. And so I think we're going to see more experimentation, and I do think we'll see progress. It just seems slow right now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Bitcoin Tina, welcome, Tina. Do you have a question for the commissioner?
Not so much a question. Commissioner, thank you very much for coming and joining us in Clubhouse and sharing your perspectives. My perspective is that I think capital markets in the United States are incredibly important. I think capital markets were made better with the 33 and 34 Act, as well as the 40 Act. I think that innovation is also critically important in the United States. And I think Bitcoin is among the most American of things. I think that the United States can take a leading role in helping to shape this future. And I think that, I hate to use this term, but foot dragging is not helping America take a leading role in what is very important. Having an ETF for Bitcoin will be very helpful and instrumental in price discovery, as well as regulation of exchanges. These are important things. And I think that there's much that's happening here which will be very beneficial for the United States, for our capital markets, ultimately for the world's capital markets and innovation. And I think the United States is falling behind other places. And I don't think the United States should fall behind. I think we are the global leader. I think this country should be at the forefront of innovation and leading the benefits that will come from good, open capital markets. I think that at the end of the day, from my perspective, light is the best disinfectant, and avoiding having things like an ETF are a way of letting things just grow in the darkness. And I think there can be tremendous benefits that come from an ETF. And I think that I look forward, I'm very pleased with the chairman. I think he knows an awful lot about this. I think he's a very smart man. And I'm looking forward to some meaningful progress that I think will be beneficial for the capital markets, for innovation, and for the United States. I mean, I don't really have a question, but thank you very much for being here, Commissioner.
Well, thank you for that comment, and thanks for the nice words. I agree with you that the chairman is really not only just smart about these issues, but I think he gets how to build a regulatory framework, and he gets the he understands the importance of having a clear regulatory framework within which our capital markets can flourish. And so I'm optimistic. I sometimes, get pretty discouraged too that the SEC, that the U.S. is falling behind. But I think that we have reason to be optimistic, and we should, really try during the next several years to build a framework that makes sense, even if it's one that, we might quibble about details, but I think the key is to get a framework in place that allows things like an exchange traded product to exist and allows people to experiment with this technology and using it to not only do things in the outside of the traditional financial world, but to try to change the way that things inside the traditional financial world are done.
Hey, Jason,
I have a follow-up question to that while we're talking about kind of the US's impact on capital markets and kind of the regulatory policies around that, if I may. So, Commissioner Peirce, your safe harbor proposal in many ways resembles a regulatory sandbox approach, which is an innovation tool that we've kind of talked about the US hasn't historically used. And a couple of years ago, you and I were talking about the SEC joining the Global Financial Innovation Network, GFIN. And I asked you then about how the SEC and other agencies might take advantage of the Global Sandbox model to experiment with potentially some ring-fence permissions for trialing harmonized guidelines across jurisdictions and taking advantage of that kind of global framework. But I don't think the SEC has kind of taken up that option yet. So, the US capital markets have a huge impact on the global economy, and US crypto policy plays a significant role in influencing the approach that a lot of other countries take in many areas of the market, and certainly crypto markets. And if anybody's serving US customers, they fall into that bucket regardless of their home jurisdiction. So I guess my question is, in your opinion, what is the US's role to play in the global policy landscape? And if you agree that the US has systemic global reach, especially within kind of the Bitcoin and crypto ecosystem, how important is it that the US collaborates with other jurisdictions to align policy where possible and foster kind of potentially controlled innovation trials through mechanisms like sandboxes?
Well, I do think that the SEC plays an important role, and there's a lot of discussion that goes on at the international level on issues around crypto and thinking through different regulatory approaches that different jurisdictions are taking. So I think a lot of that is actually really positive. I mean, we've seen it around a whole range of things, from stablecoins to DeFi, where there's work together and discussion. And part of what those international organizations do is to lay out the different approaches different jurisdictions are taking, and then that allows each jurisdiction to go back and kind of think about what it's doing and try to figure out what works. Harmonization is important, but I think it's also important to remember that each jurisdiction has its own sovereignty and should be able to regulate as it wants to. So I think it's more the role of the US to try to, ensure that there's a lot of conversation happening, ensure that people are sharing approaches, and highlight areas where differences in regulatory approaches are causing market participants difficulties. I still would like to see some sort of attempt to do a sandbox here in the US, even among the different financial regulators here in the US. I think that would be positive, but that's even difficult. So I just don't know how it works on an international level.
I had a question that's slightly different. This is Steve Paley again. And this has to do with something that I get very, very frequent questions about from clients. I'm wondering, obviously without speaking to any specific project, if you have a view as to whether US current regulations that might be applicable to decentralized exchanges are clear enough, and whether you think that's an area where we will see future rulemaking or future clarity, or if you believe that the law is it works as it is. And I'm thinking specifically, there's the notion that you can create a protocol that allows for peer-to-peer matching, but at the same time you create a website on top of it that may or may not have a token associated with it. It seems like that's an area where people have been given a lot of rope to play with, but there's at least in the view of some practitioners, there's a good amount of risk, particularly 34 Act risk. So your thoughts about that would be appreciated.
Well, I think it's a good question because there's a lot of volume of transactions occurring, and so it's an area where I would like us to provide some more clarity. I mean, my concern is that I don't want to be in the position of regulating software code, because I think that leads us down a road that's not a good one. But I know that we as regulators always look for people to hold responsible for things, and so I think people working in this space do need to be thinking carefully about whether what they're doing is going to implicate the securities laws, and so I would like to see us, get out front and maybe put something out in this space so that we can provide some clarity. And I would welcome, I mean, I'm always looking for areas where we can provide more clarity. And Steve, you and other lawyers who are very active in this space probably have great suggestions about things that we could be, providing clarity on in some form, preferably a form other than enforcement actions to start out with.
I would say one of the, obviously one avenue is no action relief, right? The problem, I would just say the problem with no action relief is it's not fast, right? There's it can take 6 months, a year, and in the meanwhile, everybody is sitting on their hands. I'm wondering if that's an area where sort of an expedited no action framework might provide an avenue for greater clarity, at least in the near term.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good suggestion. No action relief in this area has not been very satisfying to me for the reason that you cite, that it takes a really long time, and it can, after spending all that time, you can end up with relief that's so constrained that it's basically useless.
Yeah.
So if we could think about what a useful framework would look like, I mean, that's something I'm certainly happy to work on, to try to develop a framework that might be useful, and then, see if I can move that forward. But I would certainly need help in working on something like that, because
you'd certainly have it from this lawyer. And I think if we were talking about SROs before, that seems like if one was going to have a real SRO with some delegated authority, like FINRA but crypto, the ability to have expedited no action relief would certainly be something that one could consider within that ambit.
Commissioner, on a slightly follow-up question to that, we know that the SEC yourself is very open to having public discussions. We understand it's your point of view, and also Valerie Sapatnik has been very open with the crypto community, and to come in and chat with her and her team, either whether that's virtual in these days or in person. There has been some quote criticism around the fact that many of these are private conversations, which doesn't allow the broader community to understand many of the complicated legal and securities issues. Is there a way forward that you see? Yes, of course, safe harbor, more framework, but in the interim, that all these private conversations could be more of an public educational perspective for the broader community. We'll welcome your thoughts on this.
Well, Donna, I think you're right, because one of the problems when you do, and this is one of the concerns I have about the no action process, actually, if you develop a no action position and you're working with one particular applicant who wants relief, and no action positions really do only apply to that applicant, but other people are always looking to see what the no action positions are, what the conditions are, and then they model what they're doing based on those. And so if you have those discussions in private, whatever the applicant's particular concerns are the ones that, you know, that applicant is going to spend time pushing and not worry about other things. So I think there's real value to doing things in as open a way as possible. I'm certainly happy to have these conversations in whatever forum works for people. And I think that it would make sense for us to do some kind of a crypto roundtable event at the SEC. I would hope it could be joint with the CFTC at least. So I'm open to ideas like that. But, you know, any kind of conversation that people want to have with me, I'm happy to do it in a forum where others can participate and can hear what's being talked about. I benefit from getting as many perspectives as possible.
Thank you.
I've got a follow-up question.
Commissioner,
Michelle, set that up.
Oh, real quick, just Commissioner, I want to thank you so much. We have some folks who are regular club members who want to ask some questions, and I know we have you till the top of the hour, so just really appreciate it. And I just think this is all great. Go ahead with the follow-up question, and then maybe we can get Alec, Brad,
Sure.
or ask a question.
Yeah, that was me, Brad. So thanks for coming in, and I was wanting to ask you a question about the safe harbor because I was kind of confused. So most of us in here are Bitcoiners. We're passionate about Bitcoin as this new form of money, right? And we're not really paying too much attention to DeFi. We all kind of don't like the DeFi stuff happening. We think it's a lot of ICO 2.0, and it's like suckering in a lot of retail investors that are thinking that this is like Bitcoin because they like to say it's decentralized, this or that. But we all know that most of the projects that are on DeFi are centralized teams. They have VCs backing them. And really, it looks a lot like unregistered securities offerings trading on decentralized exchanges. And the narrative around that is take your stable coins, put it in this DeFi thing, earn some more tokens, you know, and there's pre-sale investments and all the same stuff that was happening in 2017 with the ICO bubble. So it just we look at that as Bitcoiners and we see this is totally crazy. The SEC in 2017 had taken action against Ether Delta because they were doing unregulated securities exchanges through a DEX. And it just feels like the narrative is kind of like, it's almost like it felt like there's a bomb went off and there's just so much DeFi stuff and decentralized exchange that it almost overwhelmed the SEC. And it feels like the SEC is only at like late 2017, maybe early 2018 for enforcement actions from that whole crypto bubble that happened in 2017. And the safe harbor is a way to kind of retroactively clean all that up. But as far as I understand, it's kind of a very, very bearish thing for these DeFi tokens that are trading at billions of dollars in market cap on the assumption that they're all actually DeFi, decentralized, and they're going to be able to continue disrupting the regulations this way. So is the intent of the safe harbor proposal to like allow this to just kind of like get cleaned up and they can still keep trading on the DEXs? Or is it to enforce the existing regulations where they're going to have to abide by all the regulations? They're going, you know, these quote unquote decentralized entities are going to have to register and get proper licensing, and that way it acts more like Bruce was saying, like digital securities that can trade on a blockchain, but they abide by all the rules. Is the intent to just allow this innovation, quote unquote innovation, to happen where the SEC and Wall Street just gets disrupted by VCs backing this smart contract DEX stuff, or is it to like rein it all in and have it comply with the rules?
Well, I mean, there's a lot in your question there. So I think that the goal of the safe harbor is to allow projects that are trying to build out a network that will eventually be decentralized or functional and will have a token operating on the network, to allow them to do that in a way that meets the legitimate concerns that purchasers aren't getting the information they need, but also recognizes that in order for a network for network effects to take hold, you have to have the token in lots of different hands of people. So, you know, regardless of whether you think those are good or bad, I think the goal is that, you know, people would get the information they need to decide whether or not they want to participate in that. Now, certainly, if something is that is just an entity trying to offer capital, offer securities in order to raise capital to build a company. I mean, that has to be done in accordance with the securities laws, and that makes sense. But it's really trying to distinguish this area where it really applying securities laws in full doesn't really seem to make sense to me. And so I'm trying to, achieve the goals of getting information out there, but also allow these networks to develop. And I do think that as with any new thing, that people who are buying into it or who are looking at it need to do so with a really skeptical eye. I always think people need to ask questions. They need to think about it. They need to think about their ability to lose money and whether or not they can afford to lose the money they're investing, or if it's not an investment, if they're purchasing an asset, they need to think about whether they can afford to lose that money. But I don't think the answer is for me as a regulator to try to figure out in advance what is going to be successful and what is not going to be successful. I mean, certainly if there's fraud, that's something that we all have to be concerned about. But some projects are going to fail and some are going to succeed. And in your mind, it might be only Bitcoin that's going to succeed, but I think others have made a different determination that there might be others in addition or instead of Bitcoin that will succeed. And as a regulator, it's just not my job to make those kind of determinations.
But specifically on the question about the decentralized exchange, like Uniswap, for example, it does enough volume now that I'm sure all the regulators are paying attention to this, because you put stable coins in there or altcoins or whatever, and it's just it's total, no rules are being followed. So is that okay based on the idea that maybe this new class of millennial investor or Gen Z investor or whatever thinks that's valuable, so you guys don't want to say, well, that's not valuable, so you're just letting it happen? Or is the plan to regulate that and make Uniswap kind of like follow the rules of a normal securities exchange?
Well, I'm not going to talk about any particular decentralized exchange, automated market maker, or any type of functionality. But look, that's something that I think Steve raised in his question too, which is, to the extent something is acting, someone is deciding to build a decentralized exchange, they have to think about potential interactions with the securities laws, and whether or not there's a securities intersection depends on whether or not they're trading digital assets that are considered to be securities, and that's an area where there's been lack of clarity. Now, you and I may disagree about, sort of from a higher level about when regulation is necessary and when it's not. But, in the role that I'm in, I'm thinking about how do the securities laws apply to a particular set of facts and circumstances. And maybe if they do apply and we decide they shouldn't, then should there be a change in either our rules or, if necessary, in the law that governs what we do? And those are questions that we can talk about. But I really have to think about things in terms of particular facts and circumstances. And that said, I'm not going to weigh in on any particular facts and circumstances here, because I can't do that.
No, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Maybe a couple more questions. You've been so generous with your time. Would that be all right?
Of course.
Oh, thanks. I think it was Huddle or Gay, Gould, or Nesky. Do we have a question?
Huddle, you want to go?
Why don't you go ahead, Jay?
No, I'm just listening. Yeah, I don't have any life-changing question here, but my question relates to the ETFs. And I know I missed the first half of this. I'm not sure. Maybe you covered this or not. But we have gold ETFs. A lot of people in the Bitcoin community view Bitcoin as digital gold. I'm not quite sure. Like you said, you can't tell us how your views on some of these things. I'm not asking you how you're going to rule on the ETFs, but it is a commodity and it's a scarce asset, and $1 trillion roughly of dollars have voted that way into this asset class. So I'm just curious, you know, what I'm trying to be careful about how to ask this because I know what you can and cannot say, but just kind of curious the view within the SEC right now on Bitcoin as an ETF. And I'm not sure if this was covered early on. I'm assuming it probably was. So if it was, maybe the TLDR.
Well, I mean, again, we'll look at any application based on its facts and circumstances, but I think you can look back to my dissent that I did in 2018 and see that I have some of the same concerns that you do, and that was in 2018, and now we're 3 years later, and I can only say that my concerns are magnified.
Ma'am, if I was just
question.
gonna, yeah, I just want to piggyback on Jay's, like the lack of decision from my vantage point looks like it's almost creating a systematic risk by not having other options for people in the market, and now they're forced to go to GBTC as a surrogate to not having an ETF. And so I'm just kind of curious if you would agree that the lack of a decision to allow more ETFs here in the U.S. market to service the desire for this is actually creating a systematic risk to the overall market.
Well, I don't know if it's a risk to the overall market, but I think that it is not ideal for investors if you force investors to look for ways other than, you know, a regular exchange traded product to get access to some of these assets. Now, you know, obviously the whole point of Bitcoin is that it's peer-to-peer, and so people certainly can get access to it, but a lot of investors want to get access through securities products that they can have in their portfolios, much like they have other securities products in their portfolios. And so I think we need to be receptive to the fact that that's what a lot of investors are looking for, and that we're not doing them any favors by not allowing them that access. So I certainly agree with you that that's a concern, and that's one that I've been raising with my colleagues so far to no avail, but perhaps that will change.
Hester,
ma'am, if I could just,
I'm sorry, I just
want
to follow up.
I just want to make one more point, Jay. On the self-directed IRA piece, it's extremely difficult for most market participants to set up their own self-directed IRA to get access to Bitcoin. So when we look at what an ETF would supply to people that aren't doing a self-directed IRA, I think that it would be a huge relief for many market participants for something like that for the approval to get accelerated. I'm sorry, Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just saw something that came out from the SEC that was on CoinDesk, and it says that FCC staff calls Bitcoin, quote, highly speculative, and hints at ETF skepticism. I'm just trying to understand, like, there are so many things that are publicly traded as securities that I think many people would say are highly speculative, like Tesla at a 1200 PE. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that I guess any prudent investor would say is highly speculative at this point.
Yeah, Jay,
right?
and that's one thing I was thinking as well. And when I thought about that, the realization I came to is that there's securities law regulating Tesla, and with gold ETFs and silver ETFs, those are mostly regulated by the CFTC, and the U.S. controls the regulation of them. Whereas I think with Bitcoin, the issue that the SEC may be seeing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's still sort of the Wild West with a lot of these exchanges and a lot of these OTC desks. However, I do think that if we go ahead and approve Bitcoin ETFs, it will perhaps drive more demand for a better regulation of those markets. And I don't think that we should, try to wait until everything's perfect to address this ongoing demand. Because if you have this many applications for Bitcoin ETFs, I think that there's so much demand that we should, try to move forward to some extent.
Yeah, just to finish up on what I was trying to say, is that there's a lot of speculative publicly traded securities. I think there's some that I think.
Can we hear from the commissioner? I think that's what
exactly
we're here for. Thanks.
Yep. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, you can go ahead and finish your question there, and then I'll weigh in on it.
Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah. So I just wanted to understand from a perspective of the SEC, you have lots of securities that are considered high risk, highly speculative, and yet the commentary coming back from the SEC is that they're commenting on Bitcoin as being highly speculative. There's not been much ruling on Bitcoin. So there's a lot of people that are taking on risk, so to speak, buying it in their self-custody, as you've mentioned. There's not a way to do this through a third-party custody that's been approved by the SEC. There's been some trusts and some private funds. Are people taking on too much risk that they may be a ruling that's going to completely crush the price down at some point? Like, I know that you can't say that you're going to have something like that, but what would your advice be to people out there that are speculating, because anything you purchase is a speculation, that you're speculating on this asset class?
Well, my advice would be the same as it is to people when they buy any asset class, or any asset, which is, use skepticism, ask a lot of questions. If you don't get your questions answered, go somewhere else. If you can't make decisions yourself, get someone to help you, get a financial professional to help you make those decisions. And, consider what your risk tolerance is when you're buying any asset. You should be thinking about what your risk tolerance is. Can you afford to lose the money that you've invested? You have to think about those kinds of things. And so that's always my advice to people. I am very concerned that the SEC is trying to be too much of a merit regulator in this area. And, I think that we as Americans also need to take responsibility for, our own financial decision making, and not look to a regulator to tell us this is a good investment or this is not a good investment for you. You got to make your own decisions.
Let me just jump in, Hester, and I appreciate the response. Thank you. The only thing I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. We're not looking to the SEC to tell us whether or not it's a good investment. I'm saying, are people taking on risk because the SEC may rule against the asset class? I think that's, and not that you can say that. I'm just saying, well, we believe in Bitcoin, but you could mess up the price based on your commentary.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, right. And some people, regulation does affect the price of assets of all kinds. So certainly that can make a difference. And I think that's sort of just a commentary on the world we live in. But I think, people just need to not look just, I hope that the value of assets is not totally determined by regulation. I hope that people are thinking about other factors than regulation when they're thinking about the value of assets.
Thank you.
Commissioner, I have a question if I may.
Real quick. Oh, hang on one second. Sorry, everyone. So, Commissioner, we're over time. I don't know if you just wanted to give a few closing thoughts, and I want to be respectful of your time. And also,
sure, I'm happy to take a couple more questions. I have a hard stop at 2:30, so I'm happy to take some more questions.
Yeah,
thank you,
Commissioner.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate you coming, and I hope that you will return in the future. The professor of mine that taught me securities regulation was also at WilmerHale and the SEC around the same time as you. And it was people from the Mercatus Institute or the Mercatus Center that convinced me to buy Bitcoin. So I've got great expectations for your time there. So, I really hope that you'll return in the future.
Hey, Jason, can we maybe take questions in order so that we don't overwhelm the commissioner?
Yeah, I've been waiting for a little bit if I could. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here. My question has to do with.
I think that Alta is next. Sorry.
I was before her, but I got dropped down. But it's okay. Go ahead, Alta. It's fine.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Commissioner Peirce, is very nice to have you in this chat, and always looking forward to your perspective. From this morning, we did see some statement from Chairman Gensler about the federal regulators trying to bring some more actions in the space. Do you think we're going to see more enforcement coming up? And is this in light of the several events that happened recently?
Well, I mean, I think we've established that we're actively engaged in enforcement in this area, and I don't expect that will change with the new chairman. And I think people should continue to think about whether the securities laws apply to what they do, and they should continue to come in and tell me where there are questions about whether and how securities laws apply. But I think certainly everyone's listening to what the new chairman says, because the new chairman does set the agenda and the tone for the agency.
Thanks very much. And Remo, I do know you were waiting in the Remo, Neski, and then Dr. Cruz.
Awesome. Thank you. So my question has to do with what's known as the single biggest theft in human history. And that's when we went from direct ownership of shares to indirect ownership of shares in 1994. And part of my ignorance, I'm not sure if this applies to ETFs, but there's a lot of inaccuracies, right, that come along with the legacy system ledger. It's never in perfect sync. It takes, 2 days to settle a trade? And then that goes through at least half a dozen different intermediaries. And so my question has to do with rehypothecation and hypothecation in general. How does regulation of ETFs in the Bitcoin space help to protect against that?
Well, I'm not sure that I would tie those two together. I have to think about that a little bit more, to be honest with you. But I think a lot of people are looking at blockchain as a potential solution to some of the problems that and concerns that you raised in your question. And so I think we'll see, and we have seen people already trying to experiment with blockchain to address some of those concerns. And then there's also a lot of pressure now to think about whether we need to shorten the settlement cycle, which would again address some of those concerns that you raised. There's certainly costs to shortening the settlement cycle as well that we need to take into account, but also potential benefits of taking some of the risk out of the system. So that's certainly something that will be under consideration in light of some of the events that happened in the markets earlier this year.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Remo. Neski? Hi, Neski.
Hi, thank you so much, Commissioner, for visiting Cafe Bitcoin and being generous with your time. Just a really quick follow-up question. If you could comment on a timeline for enforcing rules. It's kind of in follow-up to Gary Gensler's comment. Like, is there any particular timeline as a Q2, Q3? If you could comment, thank you.
Our enforcement program is constantly working, and we have quite a few of our staff are enforcement lawyers, and so they're always working on it. But I think it's important to remember that our remit is really quite broad, and so we've got a lot of potential actions that we can bring, and our staff is very careful and does in-depth investigations, and so those can take time. I think all of us on the commission are committed to timely enforcement, because timely enforcement is more effective enforcement. But it certainly is, it's a challenge to cover the landscape, and so I think sometimes people expect that, for example, if they submit a tip to the SEC, they're going to see an enforcement action the next day, and I would just caution people that part of what a government needs to do is engage in due process, in conduct a fair and thorough investigation, and so that does take time, and people just need to bear that in mind.
Thank you. Dr. Jack Cruz.
Hey, thank you. Given the things that we've heard out of the OCC and Sheldon Brown in the last couple of days, reading between the lines, it seems that regulation is going to be probably targeted between exchanges and stable coins. My question is not only just for you, but the general feeling, the viewpoint pertaining to stable coins, especially those that are pegged to a fiat currency. Where are we at right now?
Well, I don't know. I mean, one thing I should say is that the SEC has limited jurisdiction over stable coins. Now, there are certainly some that would fall within our jurisdiction, but one that is based on a single fiat probably is less likely. Of course, the facts and circumstances do matter. So don't, you need to, if you're building a stable coin or using a stable coin, you need to think about whether the securities laws apply. I think that the fact that stable coins are really being widely used and that people see that they're being widely used will also, that regulators see that. I mean, I think that also means that we see that they have value to people. And so want to make sure that we have a framework that allows people to use things that they have value, that they find value in.
But specifically to regulation on the stable coins, especially considering the things that have happened in the space the last couple of years, has the flavor changed from say 2018 to now?
Well, I think the flavor has changed in that stable coins have really had quite a rapid rise in popularity, and so that's always going to attract the attention of regulators. There's been a lot of work on the international front on, they like to call them so-called stable coins, but so that's certainly an area of crypto that is getting attention, and I think there's a bit of a jostling for position, and governments are looking at building CBDCs, and then there's stable coins, and so I think everyone is watching a little bit to see where things come out. But certainly regulation from securities regulators and regulation from other financial regulators is something that stablecoin issuers need to be very cognizant of. It's difficult for me, from my perch at the SEC, which has jurisdiction only over certain kinds of stablecoins, to predict where the future of regulation for stablecoins is going to go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Commissioner, I have a question. First of all, I have to say I'm really impressed. There's 1,300 people in this room, which is really high for a clubhouse room. So you draw a very big audience. One of the things I was thinking about, and I'm curious your take on kind of Elon Musk and Saturday Night Live and his comments, and watching the price of a cryptocurrency drop suddenly. One day he's using Bitcoin to be accepted for payment of his Tesla vehicles. The next, he makes a decision that he shouldn't do it. It's not environmentally friendly. It seems like now we now have this new phenomenon in our society of like the ultimate echo chamber, where like one person can just start tweeting something and they have that power to really impact. And again, this goes to maybe what your chairman was saying in terms of there's that gap in our system in terms of regulating the spot markets for some of these coins. But does that just concern you overall, just outside of your role at the SEC, seeing the what almost looks like it's basically manipulation of a price, and the power to be able to do that via one of these platforms, whether it's Clubhouse, Twitter, or SNL?
Well, I'm not going to speak about any particular person or set of events, but I'll say that celebrity endorsement is not new to the securities markets, and we have put out investor alerts on celebrity endorsement and encourage people to think for themselves. And again, I mean, I come back to my mantra of be skeptical and ask lots of questions before you put your hard-earned money into anything. And people need to do that, and we as regulators do not do anyone favors by saying, don't worry, just rely on us, we'll take care of it for you. You've got to ask questions, and you should have your own reasons for making an investment, whether your reason is just because you think it would, you think there's a long-term value, or you are engaged in shorter-term trading. You should have your own reasons, and you should have your own risks, do your own risk assessment and your own, assessment of whether you can afford to lose your money. So, I think these are lessons that we need to teach people very young. One, that, they need to have they need to do some thinking about their finances. They need to think about the money coming in and the money going out, what you're spending it on, how you're investing it. And those are just solid lessons that apply no matter what the area is. And you don't always have to listen to what everyone else does. You can make your own decisions. That's the beauty of this country, is that we prize the ability of the individual to think for herself. And I certainly want to encourage people to take advantage of the liberty they have to do that.
I have a follow-up question to that, actually, Commissioner Peirce. So in addition to regulating exchanges, marketing and promotions in general seems to be another area of consumer protection that Chairman Gensler has raised concerns about really recently. And equally, there's concerns shared here by regulators in the UK and Europe. The UK recently has undertaken a public consultation on an intention to bring crypto marketing specifically into the financial promotions regulatory regime. So not regulating crypto, but basically any type of customer communication, marketing, promotional activity would need to be reviewed and approved by a FSMA regulated firm, which is quite a big deal, right? And there's some similar provisions within the MICA proposal for Europe. And we've seen blatant token pump promotions and scam marketing, claiming some pretty incredible returns on social media. But are the policymakers concerned around crypto marketing? They seem to be broader than just preventing scams. So I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on this? And do you think that more financial promotions regulation would actually protect consumers, going back to people thinking for themselves? Or do you see that there might be a more kind of pragmatic balance?
Well, I think there's a pragmatic balance, and one that also recognizes the ability of people to people have a right to talk about things and discuss things with one another. I think the first line of defense is common sense, and people need to use their common sense in assessing whether when someone is promising them the moon, whether or not that is actually achievable. And regulation certainly has a place, but regulation can't substitute for common sense, because we can't plug every hole that's going to open up. People need to be using their own minds in assessing whether or not they want to put their money into something. And so I worry that when we try to craft a regulatory regime that stops every bad thing from happening in advance, certainly we try, right? That's our goal, is to try to stop fraud from happening, to try to stop bad actors from doing their thing. But really the front line of defense is people themselves. And I think no matter what regulatory regime you have in place, you're still going to need people to think for themselves.
Jason, can I follow up on your last question here?
Yeah, Jay, go ahead. Yeah, no, you were starting.
Okay. Hi, Hester. Just to follow up to the, as you called it, the celebrity endorsement. And then there's also celebrity opposition, right? So you can endorse something. You could also try to drive a price down. So you can go out and be a proponent of an asset class, a stock, a company. But my understanding is that the stated mission, or however you want to characterize it for the SEC, is kind of three-part: protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. And so if you have individuals, I'm not going to name names here, that are saying things that are either positive or negative to Bitcoin publicly, particularly in opposition, if they turn around and purchase it after it drops 50%, is that considered market manipulation under the SEC's rules? And would you take action against companies or individuals that drive a price down through commentary, which clearly can be indicated by the commentary they have and the immediate drop in price, and then their action of purchasing it later? Is that something you would investigate?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. Yes, we can investigate market manipulation, but we investigate market manipulation involving securities. And so we sometimes do bring those kinds of cases. But we operate within our jurisdiction. So if an asset is not a security and there's alleged manipulation of that asset, it wouldn't be within our jurisdiction. We focus on on manipulation in the securities markets. Now, manipulation cases can be very difficult to prove, and they're you know, we always look at the facts and circumstances of any particular case. So that's kind of what drives us when we're thinking about manipulation cases. But again, I think people need to remember that they always need to make their own decisions and think for themselves. And so, you know, certainly if anyone is aware of any misconduct in the securities markets, they should let us know. You can go to our website. There's a place where you can file tips, complaints, and referrals to us. And I encourage you to do that when you see bad activity in the securities markets. That's one really important source of tips.
The reason I mentioned the three-part mission is that your job, right, at the SEC is to protect investors and maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets. So you're saying that Bitcoin is not considered a security. Is that correct? And that's why you meant somebody.
Yeah, that's
Bitcoin is not a security.
Yeah. Hang on. Let the commissioner respond.
And that's the reasoning for it, right? As to why it would not be investigated potentially.
Yeah. And I think so Commissioner, I think too, does this go back to a little bit of what you were saying before at the beginning when we're talking about what Gary Gensler's talking about there being this sort of gap in the regulation where there really isn't a regime? Would you say it's almost, we're not naming names, right? But the argument of maybe there does need to be some sort of regime overlooking the spot markets of Bitcoin, because technically your regulatory body just doesn't have the ability to police that kind of behavior.
Well, Jason, look, I've got to run here in a second, so I want to thank you for hosting me today, and I really appreciate all your kind comments. I tend to be someone who's you know, fairly libertarian-minded in the sense that I believe that people can do a lot of things on their own and do them well without government regulation. There is a place for government regulation, and we as a society need to sit down and talk to one another to figure out what the right balance is between regulation and allowing you know, markets to regulate themselves and things to develop their own sense of private ordering. I'm happy to have those conversations. It sounds like I might come to a different place than some of the others in this room. I don't think everything in our society needs to be regulated by the government. Markets regulate themselves and can do that quite effectively. But I'm happy to have those conversations with people. Come in and talk to me. The chairman has opened the door to talking about regulating the spot markets and crypto. And if that's something that you support, you should tell them that you support that. You can you know, convey that message. But I think, you know, be careful as you go down the road of thinking that you want everything to be regulated by the government, because government regulation, to go back to our earlier part of the conversation, tends to be very inflexible and very slow to change and adapt to new circumstances. So be careful what you're asking for, because when you get it, you might not like the way it works out.
Commissioner, thank you so much. And if people could just tap your microphone to thank the commissioner for coming on Clubhouse and just getting in this forum with us, I really appreciate it. And boy, thank you. And we hope to have you back again. Really appreciate your interaction with us today, Commissioner.
I'd love to come back. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, for organizing this very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks so much,
Jason.
Thanks,
Jason.
Michelle.
Great job. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Jason.
Hey, are we going to keep the room open to discuss posts?
We certainly can, Brad. If you have some thoughts that you want to kick off, I want to thank Brecky. I don't know if you've been able to take a pause and finally be able to speak, but Brecky helped with doing the YouTube live, and thank you so much, man. Really.
No worries.
Thank you, Brecky. Thank you.
I just wanted to let everyone know as well, I am going to be ending the live stream, but the room will keep recording. So if there's some good questions and banter and conversation later, then maybe we can post the rest of it. But got to end the stream now.
Sure. Thanks a lot, and thanks to Swan Bitcoin and Cafe Bitcoin for being such a great